I stand here, the camera will be fine?
Yep.
Okay. Thank you very much, Carol, for that warm introduction and for hosting the event tonight. And thank you, too, to the library for hosting us, and where are Lynn and Kim Hyun? Oh, there you are. And you, too, for sponsoring us. And most of all, thank you to all of you for coming tonight. Without you, there's no event. I'm not going to stand up here alone, so thank you very much for coming. As Carol said, I just finished a 5-year assignment in Korea. There are 4 languages in the world which American diplomats have to study for 2 years. Typical language is about 6 months: the German, French, Italian, Spanish, Portuguese. So-called hard languages, 1 year. That's Russian, all the Slavic languages, Vietnamese, and so forth. Anybody want to guess what the 4 super hard languages are? Arabic is 1. Chinese is 1. 2 more. Well, come on, Korean. I gave you that one. That's 3, but you're batting 1,000. Japanese. Wow, sharp crowd you've got here. So usually when I ask that, there's 1 or 2 mistakes, but you got 4 out of 4, so hats off to you. So I had to go to Seoul for 2 years to learn the language, then I worked there for 3 years at the embassy. But I also lived there in 1979 and 1980 as a very young GI. I was in the U.S. Army there. So I've followed Korea now for almost 40 years. And tonight I want to talk about, we've also been negotiating, trying to negotiate a deal with North Korea for about 30 years. And I hope you'll bear with me as I go through a little bit of the history of those talks. So far we've never succeeded. And I think by looking at the previous failures, you'll learn a little bit about what the chances are for success in the ongoing efforts. Many of the basic outline of the previous attempts is very similar to the one that we're seeing today. The U.S. asks North Korea to make some reductions in its military capabilities. Initially, we were asking them to reduce their missiles because they didn't have nuclear weapons. Then we started asking them to stop their nuclear program, stop enriching uranium or building plutonium. And then finally, we're up to the stage now where we're asking them to eliminate their nuclear weapons. In exchange, North Korea asked for an upgrade in relations between Washington and Pyongyang to some sort of official relations, diplomatic relations, formal economic relations that would lead to diplomatic ties and embassies in each capital. They also want an end to sanctions and economic assistance, and they want some kind of security assurances. Usually that means a formal document that would replace the armistice that was signed in 1953. I think most of you know the war isn't officially over. We agreed to cease hostilities, but technically the war is still on. And so they would like us to replace that with a treaty. In almost every case, these failed talks had the same elements. I'm encouraged by the signs that I see President Trump and Chairman Kim seem to have hit it off personally. The atmospherics now are much better than they were. It's only 13 months ago that President Trump was using his fire and fury rhetoric that Carol mentioned. So we've come a long way, at least in terms of atmospherics. But in actual concrete measures towards denuclearization or towards the establishment of official ties or the release of sanctions, none of that's happened on either side for the most part yet. So we'll get started. Before I do, I need to give a shout out to CFR, the Council on Foreign Relations. CFR.org is their website. They have at the bottom something called explainers, and one of the explainers is a history of the negotiations with North Korea over nuclear issues. I asked for their permission. They said I can borrow heavily on that, so thank you to CFR. Some of the places I'm going to be referring to tonight you should know about. The DMZ. This line is the DMZ, and Kaesong is right here. Seoul is here. This used to be a capital about 1,000 years ago. It was the historical capital of the whole peninsula. But they started an industrial park there, and this Friday, South Korea will open a liaison office. It's in effect a de facto embassy. We've been trying to discourage them from doing that, we being the U.S. government. I have to remember I'm retired now. I don't represent the U.S. government anymore. But they're going to open that up with about 30 people per side. And we tried to discourage them by saying that they're going to take a fuel oil they're going to take up fuel oil so they can run the generators and provide electricity and everything. We said, no, you can't do that. You're not allowed to import fuel oil to North Korea. That violates the UN sanction and so forth. So they're going to do it anyways this Friday. It's a big step for them. Several other things that are going on that you should know about. Next Tuesday, the president of South Korea, Moon Jae-in, will be meeting with Chairman Kim, again in North Korea. Friday this week, there are some generals from North Korea meeting their counterparts from South Korea, very high-level military talks to see if they can do things to reduce tension, strengthen their ties. It looks like next month, October, there's a good chance that Shinzo Abe will meet with Chairman Kim in Pyongyang. And it looks like sometime this fall there could be another summit between Trump and Kim. So there's a lot of very encouraging atmospherics. Also this week in Vladivostok, there's a meeting of Shinzo Abe, President Putin, Xi Jinping, and the South Korean Prime Minister. And they're talking about steps they can take to integrate the economies, specifically to integrate rail and road links. If they can get North Korea to act as to allow trains to go from South Korea through North Korea to Russia, it'll be a huge step forward in increasing economic ties between South Korea and other countries in the region. South Korea has been trying to achieve this for a long, long time. All right, so there have been many previous unsuccessful attempts. They were sustained, they were complicated talks, and under conditions, I would argue, more favorable than the ones that we have today, primarily because today North Korea has nuclear weapons. So it took us 4 years to negotiate the Iranian agreement, the JCPOA, the Joint Committee's Plan of Action. Iran doesn't have nuclear weapons. It took us a long time to negotiate a plan that basically said you won't acquire nuclear weapons until the end of the agreement. So conditions today are going to be harder and they're going to be more complicated. It's going to take a sustained effort and a lot of good luck. And you need the good luck because so many things can derail the talks. You'll see that the death of Kim Jong Un's grandfather, Kim Il-sung, that derailed the talks. You'll see elections. In 1994, the Democrats looked like they had a program that was going to work, but then they signed an agreement in October with North Korea, the U.S. government. In November of 1994, Congress changed hands from Democrats to Republicans, and everything fell apart. Political scandals. Clinton came very close to going to North Korea in a summit. He got tied up at the end of his term with Monica Lewinsky in the blue dress and impeachment hearings in the House, and the clock ran out. He didn't make it. So we should also expect both progress and setbacks. If you look at these earlier examples of failures, you'll notice that there were times when it was very hopeful and other times where it was closer to the fire and fury, where there was a lot of bad intentions being voiced publicly. And then finally, we'll look at the timing. Of the 6 countries that are parties to the 6-country talks, the U.S. has the shortest amount of time before the next election. And President Trump, he's looking for something that he can deliver before the midterm elections in November, not even 2 months away. All right, so we're going to begin in 1985. This is when North Korea says it wants to join the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. When you join the NPT, you basically say, I swear I have no intention of ever acquiring nuclear weapons. And this is not the first time that North Korea will say they want to join the NPT. They were in, they were out, they were in, they were out. They built their first nuclear facilities in the 1980s. At this time, neither North Korea nor South Korea has any nuclear weapons. The only nuclear weapons on the Korean Peninsula belong to us. And I remember when I was a soldier, they had nuclear missiles American nuclear missiles on the base on which I lived. We go forward to 1991 in the strategic arms reduction talks between George H.W. Bush and Mikhail Gorbachev. We agreed to limit the amount of nuclear weapons that we deploy overseas. And so we agree, in effect, to get rid of our nuclear weapons on the Korean Peninsula. Now, when we look at the later agreements, you'll see there's a lot of talk about denuclearizing the Korean Peninsula. I'm not sure what that means because there aren't any nuclear weapons, at least on the southern half of the Korean Peninsula, as far as I know. But there's some room for interpretation on that. Does that refer to the American submarines just offshore that have nuclear missiles? Does that refer to the American bombers in Guam that have nuclear weapons? But 1991, we started to get rid of ours. It took a couple of years, but they got rid of more than 100 missiles. 1992, both Koreas agreed to denuclearize. Again, neither one has any nuclear weapons at the time. But they agree, and you can see the second sentence there, to not test, manufacture, produce, receive, possess, store, deploy, or use nuclear weapons. They also agree not to reprocess nuclear waste to make plutonium from a graphite-cooled reactor or to enrich uranium. Now, this is not the first time you're going to see this tonight. As I said, North Korea went into the NPT and out of the NPT. This is not the first time that North Korea promises to not receive, possess, store, deploy, or use nuclear weapons. In January 1993, the JNCC, that was the implementing mechanism for that agreement that we just looked at, held its only meeting. They only met once. They were supposed to have a body that would go across the DMZ, check the sites in South Korea, check the sites in North Korea. They met once and they never did any inspections. But at this meeting, North Korea says, you know what, we don't want to discuss any kind of disarmament until the U.S. and South Korea end their military exercises. They're supposed to start this month in January and last until March. We find those exercises very provocative, and we're not going to talk about getting rid of our weapons while you guys are holding these exercises. We want you to cancel them. We didn't cancel them. So 3 months later, in March, North Korea says, you know what, we're going to leave the NPT. The inspectors from the International Atomic Energy Agency have to leave. At the end of March, South Korea says, you know what, these exercises that just finished, the ones that you found so provocative, we'll stop doing them forever if you come back into the NPT. So in June, North Korea says, yeah, all right, that seems like a good deal. You stop the exercises for good, we'll come back into the NPT. 1994, January, South Korea says, we're going to restart the exercises unless you allow the IAEA inspectors back in. So the first inspections take place in March of 94. And North Korea goes on to say, we're ready to terminate construction of this graphite-moderated nuclear reactor in exchange for a light water nuclear reactor and economic incentives. The significance of how the reactor is cooled is that a graphite-moderated reactor, you can take the spent fuel rods out and make them into plutonium, which is a material that can be used to make nuclear weapons. You can't take the spent fuel out of a light water reactor and make it into plutonium. In June of 1994, ex-President Carter goes there. We're at a kind of high right now in June, not unlike the period we're in right now. Carter goes there, and Kim Il-sung, the grandfather of the current chairman, Kim Jong Un, he says, I'd like to have a historical summit. I'd like to invite the president of South Korea to come here, and we can talk about improving relations and so forth. Unfortunately, Kim Il-sung dies in July. But this period, as I said, was a kind of a happy moment. It led to something called the Agreed Framework. And this is the first of the agreements we can look at tonight. This was signed in October of 1994, took 1 year to negotiate. The agreement was non-binding. Okay? If you want to have a treaty that binds the U.S. government to some kind of activity, you need 67 votes in the Senate. It has to be ratified by the Senate. This wasn't. It was also, I think, worth noting that there were only 2 parties to this agreement. If we tried to do this today, China's going to be in on it, Japan's going to be in on it, South Korea's going to be in on it too. There'll be many other parties. It's going to be a little bit more complicated. But under this, North Korea agrees to freeze its plutonium weapons program, stop construction on the reactor. The U.S. agrees to sanctions relief, to give aid. We gave heavy fuel oil, 2 light water reactors. They're very similar to many of the things that we're promising now. Neither side keeps its promise on this, by the way. But remember, this was signed in October of 1994. And this is the actual agreement. When I show you slides and the background is white, that's the official text of an agreement. There are 3 points on this agreement. You can't read it, but the first point says both sides will cooperate to replace North Korea's graphite-moderated reactor and related facilities with light water reactors. And the rest of the text deals with that point. The second point says, as soon as possible after the date of this document, U.S. and North Korean experts will hold 2 sets of expert talks. One of them, I'm going to go down to here. The 2 sides will move towards full normalization of political and economic relations. Okay. We're going to hear that many, many times tonight. Within 3 months of the date of this document, so this was October 94, so by January of 95, both sides will reduce barriers to trade and investment. Each side will open a liaison office. That never happens. And then finally, the third part, and usually this comes at the end of the agreements with North Korea, is the part about denuclearization. Both sides will work together for peace and security and a nuclear-free Korean peninsula. Again, it doesn't say North Korea is going to get rid of its nuclear weapons. It says both sides will work towards a nuclear-free Korean peninsula. So I want to talk about that second part, the liaison office, to give you an example of how complicated the negotiations can be, but also how close we got to succeeding. And just bear in mind how difficult this was, that under the Clinton administration, we talked about having a liaison office. Later on, you'll see under the Obama administration, we talked about having a liaison office. And Trump, I'm sure this will come up. There will be talk about a liaison office. So under the Clinton administration in '94, each side was going to start with 7 people. The increases would be reciprocal, and it would build up until we had embassies in Pyongyang and in Seoul. The U.S. was going to use a satellite dish so we could have secure communications. North Korea would have to rely on AT&T, phone line capable of voice and data transmission. This was 1994. Give them a break. The State Department named somebody to be the head of the liaison office. It was a career diplomat named Richard Spence. He and the others began studying North Korean at the Embassy Language School, the same place I had to suffer through 2 years ago. I mean, the same place I studied Korean after 2 years. It's probably not very well known. Both the people in North Korea and the people in South Korea speak Korean, but only about 70% of the vocabulary is mutually intelligible. South Korea, because it's much more open to the outside world, has far more loanwords. So when the refugees from North Korea come down to South Korea, they have no idea what a personal trainer is or what a cappuccino is or something. So they have all this, the refugees, when they come, they actually get classes in Korean. But our American diplomats were in school beginning to study Korean so that they could go to Pyongyang and work. We looked at the schools. There are many countries that have embassies in Pyongyang. The Brits do, the Germans do, the French do, and so forth. Their kids go to school in Pyongyang. If we're going to send Americans to work in Pyongyang, their kids are going to have to go to school somewhere. So the State Department looked at the schools and decided they were not to American standards. So the kids are going to have to go to school in Seoul. Then we said, well, can we cross the DMZ so that the kids can come home on the weekend and holidays? Or when we supply the office in Pyongyang, can we cross the DMZ? It's much easier just to drive up from Seoul. Or if there's a medical emergency, can we just drive up from Seoul? They said, no, you've got to go through Beijing. We're not going to use the DMZ. We also looked for office space and for housing in Pyongyang. Now this is 1994. Where's Hoonigan? You remember in 1994-95 there was something called the Arduous March in North Korea. It was a famine. Something like 3 million people starved to death. People were eating bark and grass and so forth. It was a terrible time. Pyongyang was much less developed than it is now. Say what you will about Kim Jong Un, he has led to a housing boom. There's been a lot of construction. It would be easier to find housing today. There was very little housing available then, but what happened was, if you remember, Germany unified in the early 90s. So the old East German mission was empty. And East Germany had 140 diplomats in Pyongyang. I think about 139 of them probably worked for the intelligence agencies. But so they had this huge facility that was empty. And we looked at it and we said, we think we can probably use this. So we got in touch with the German government in Bonn and began negotiations on a lease for the space. And we eventually signed an agreement with the German government for 7 apartments, 2 heated garages, office space, joint use of the tennis court, and temporary use of the ambassador's residence for parties because Germany hadn't assigned an ambassador yet. So at this stage, we think things are looking pretty good. The diplomats are studying Korean, they're getting ready to go. We found housing, we found offices, we've got a satellite dish for communications. The kids have arranged schools in Seoul. Things are looking very promising. We're not nearly this far along now. There's some encouraging signs in the rhetoric and everything, but we're nowhere near this level yet. The whole thing was supposed to start officially with an exchange of letters. The North Korean government would send a letter to the Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian Affairs and Pacific Affairs at the State Department. The letter kept not coming and not coming and not coming. In the summer, they said, you know, we're putting it off indefinitely. And then at the end of the year, they said, we've changed our mind. We don't want to do this. And then also, you remember that this was signed in October of '94. And in November of '94, you had the takeover of Congress by the Republican Party. So a lot of the things that we had intended to do under the Clinton administration, they didn't have the votes anymore in Congress to do. So the new Republican Congress withheld the funds. We had promised to deliver tons and tons and tons and tons of heavy fuel oil. North Korea has a serious energy shortage at this time. And we couldn't do it because Congress needs to appropriate the money. Congress said, no, we're not going to give you the money. And so we didn't deliver the oil on time as we'd promised. We did later, but we didn't deliver it on time. Also, North Korea had hoped for relief from the sanctions, and Congress didn't approve that. The U.S. didn't pursue the normal economic and political relations as agreed. I think on that one, we tried pretty hard. I don't blame the Americans for that one at all. And then the worst thing was that North Korea began to cheat. They started secretly enriching uranium. We got word of that. So, in spite of that, in 2000, and I could go a little, maybe, I'm going to talk about something that's not on the screen there. In 2005, North Korea says, no, we don't have a uranium enrichment program. And then in 19, never mind, I'll get to that in a minute. In 2000, we have the first Inter-Korean summit. The fellow on the left is Kim Dae-jung, DJ. He won the Nobel Peace Prize for this. And Kim Jong Il, the son of Kim Il-sung, who died, he's on the right there. They have the first ever Inter-Korean summit, 2 leaders. It produces something called the Kaesong Industrial Complex. I pointed to Kaesong on the border there when we started. This was, when I left Korea, there were 55 Korean companies, South Korean companies, employing about 125,000 North Korean workers. So the North Koreans would come in every day and work at these factories that were run by South Korean companies, making things like belts and shoes and so forth. And then those could be exported. Under our free trade agreement, you can't export things from Kaesong to the U.S. as South Korean goods, only as North Korean goods. And right now we're not dealing with North Korea, so you can't import anything from Kaesong. But under the European Free Trade Agreement, you could export things from Kaesong to Europe as South Korean goods. That's shut down now. And South Korea this Friday will reopen their liaison office with a couple of very large buildings, and they're taking up tons and tons of fuel oil and other things to supply that building, and for the families who are living there and so forth. And I think their goal is to reopen the industrial park as well as many, many other similar facilities. South Korea is very keen to get going again on strengthening economic ties. So following the summit between these two, the U.S. does ease some sanctions and start allowing trade and investment. And then later that year in October, North Korean general goes to the U.S. He's the highest ranking North Korean to ever visit Washington. He meets Clinton in the White House. And then Madeleine Albright goes and meets Kim Jong Il in Pyongyang. Again, things are looking pretty rosy right now. But the clock runs out. Clinton he was thinking about going to Pyongyang and having a summit with Kim Jong Il, but he decides, I've got too many other things right now, I'm fighting off impeachment in the House and so forth. It never happens. When Madeleine Albright leaves, her successor was Colin Powell. And she talked to Colin Powell, and the assumption was that the incoming government would continue to pursue the same policies. If you remember, Bush takes office, and he has his axis of evil speech. We have in the front row here another Foreign Service officer, Alan Carlson, who worked for a man named John Bolton. John Bolton, who's now the National Security Advisor, was then our UN ambassador, and arguably the most hawkish of any American officials on North Korea. He said, no, we're not going to pursue this Clinton stuff. A lot of people wonder what would have happened if Al Gore had won Florida. Would things have been different? I think the Democrats would have tried, but as I said, North Korea did cheat, and there was that other issue. But we'll never know for certain. The world could have been very different. Anyways, we'd promised to build the 2 light water reactors. We started in 1995 an organization called KEDO, K-E-D-O, the Korean Peninsula Energy Development Organization. We put about $1.5 billion into building these 2 light water nuclear reactors. One was about half done, and one was about 15% done. They were supposed to go online in 2003, but we only started building them in 2002, so they were way behind schedule. In the end, we pulled the plug. We said, we're not going to finish these things. North Korea took all the equipment that was there. Fortunately, we hadn't delivered any fissile material or anything. None of the key nuclear components were there, but they took the equipment away. And then in January 2003, North Korea says, we're pulling out of the NPT. August of 2003, 8 months later, the 6-party talks begin in Beijing. In February 2005, North Korea says, we're working on a nuclear weapon. And in October 2006, they do their first nuclear test. In February 2007, North Korea agrees to shut its nuclear facilities in exchange for 50,000 tons of fuel from South Korea and normal relations with U.S. and Japan. So you should start to see, this is not the first time you've seen normal relations with U.S. and Japan. It's not the first time you've seen, we give you oil and you freeze your nuclear program. In April 2009, things take a turn for the worse. North Korea pulls out of the talks and expels all nuclear inspectors. Late in 2009, Barack Obama offers to open up a liaison office if Pyongyang comes back to the talks. And according to the unconfirmed news reports at the time, the site would have opened in the first half of 2010, and it would have gradually evolved into a full diplomatic mission, an embassy. Again, we keep seeing the same thing and the same attempts resulting in the same failures. So the 6-party talks didn't work. Why? North Korea wanted diplomatic ties. They wanted full, normal relations. The U.S. wavered. We demanded complete, verifiable, irreversible dismantlement before establishing ties. Japan was leaning towards our point of view. The other 3 parties, South Korea, China, and Russia, they favored incremental disarmament. And that's still their position today. Well, they said, one side does a little bit, the other side reciprocates, small steps, not complete, verifiable, irreversible disarmament before we give them anything. North Korea wanted the U.S. to make the first move. You give us concessions and then we'll get rid of our nuclear weapons. Oh, sorry. So I'm going to fast forward to where we are today. Say a little bit about South Korean politics today. Traditionally, there are 2 parties in South Korea, but it's not like the Democrats and Republicans. There's a conservative bloc and a liberal bloc. They change their names constantly. When I studied Korean at the Embassy Language School, the textbook that we used had the names of the parties crossed off, and then underneath it they would write down the new iteration, and then it would be crossed off after a year. And I don't even know what they're called now, to be honest. I'm sorry. But the conservative bloc is generally confrontational towards North Korea. They lean more towards spending money on defense. The liberal bloc is more inclined towards rapprochement with Pyongyang. And they want to, if you saw Kim Dae-jung, he was from the liberal bloc. South Korea's highest priority now, and under any liberal government, is usually improvement in inter-Korean relations. And we're going to look now at 3 inter-Korean agreements. These are agreements between North and South Korea. And then I want to compare that to the agreement between North Korea and President Trump. So the first of these agreements was in June of 2000. And I'm not going to read the whole thing, but if you go to the 3rd paragraph where it's underlined, you'll see reunification independently and through the joint efforts of the Korean people who are masters of the country. So most of these agreements between South and North Korea, they talk about the Korean people, not about South Koreans and North Koreans, the Korean people, and how they are the masters of their own fate. South Koreans will say, you know, our country was torn apart by these superpowers in their silly Cold War. It had nothing to do with us. We should drive the efforts towards unification. We want to be in charge of that. And the next paragraph actually spells out the plan for unification. It's going to be, the South wants a confederation, the North is a little bit, they call it a loose form of confederation. They don't want to have too much control by South over the North, but they're interested in discussing some kind of confederation that would allow both countries to occupy the same peninsula. And then the second to the last paragraph, they're going to consolidate mutual trust by promoting economic cooperation, stimulating cooperation and exchanges in civic, cultural, sports, health, environmental, and all other fields. The thing that you don't see in this agreement, and this is the whole agreement from June of 2000, is anything about weapons or the military. There's nothing about denuclearization in here. The next inter-Korean agreement I want to look at is from 2007. And this was between a liberal president, Roh Moo-hyun, and Kim Jong Un. Both sides supported development of inter-Korean peace and prosperity, and they want international talks to replace the armistice with a permanent peace treaty. And interestingly enough, the current president, Moon Jae-in, was President Roh Moo-hyun's chief of staff. So the current South Korean president actually participated in this earlier agreement. And then this is the latest one. This is from April of 2018 with Moon Jae-in. And it's a bit longer than the earlier ones, but I think it's worth looking at. Particularly, I want to look at the parts that I've underlined. So this reflects the enduring aspiration of the Korean people. Again, no distinction between South and North. The Korean people for peace, prosperity, and unification. And then at the bottom, a new era of peace has begun. It's not forward-looking. After you get rid of your nuclear weapons, we'll talk about helping you. No, it's already happened. America, the train has left the station. You've missed out on this. The second thing I want to call your attention to is how urgent they see this. And if you look at the end of the first paragraph, it's the desire of the whole nation. Again, it doesn't say which nation, the whole peninsula, the whole nation. And the urgent calling of the times that cannot be held back any further. The second paragraph, South and North Korea affirm the principle of determining the destiny of the Korean nation. No distinction between South and North. The Korean nation on their own accord. The next paragraph. This is where they agree to open a liaison office, the one that's going to open this Friday. So back in April, when they signed this agreement, they announced the plans to open the liaison office, and it'll happen in 2 days now. There's going to be about 30 people on both sides. The South Korean side will be led by the Vice Minister of Unification. South Korea has a Ministry of Unification. They promise more and more joint activities. If you look down towards the end, the two sides agreed to demonstrate their collective wisdom, talents, and solidarity by participating in international sports events, such as the 2018 Asian Games. If you look at a Korean newspaper today, I guarantee you every day there's going to be a story about some athletic event or something somewhere where the two Koreas are participating in a joint team. And the uniforms that they wear, it doesn't have the South Korean flag, it doesn't have the North Korean flag. It has just one picture of the Korean peninsula, undivided. And even this week in Georgia, the American Georgia, north of Atlanta, there's a lake, Lanier, and they're having the World Dragon Boat Championship. And North and South Korea had hoped to field a joint team. They did very well at the Asian Games. The joint team won 5 medals at the Asian Games. The Americans said no. Well, we said we don't have time to process the visas for the North Koreans. We're terribly sorry. More reunions. I think you've probably seen in the newspaper there's been some coverage recently of the reunions of families that were divided by the Korean War. South Korea started this 40-some years ago. They asked all the South Koreans who were interested in meeting family members who were north of the DMZ, and 135,000 South Koreans signed up. So far, 4,800 have participated in the program, and about 75,000 have died. So cynics will say North Korea holds this out as a kind of carrot. You do something for us, and we'll let a few hundred of your South Koreans come and meet their family members. I think they could have probably allowed more than that, but they've promised in this April agreement to step that up a little bit. So I think we will hear more about this soon. A lot more trade infrastructure. As I mentioned, President Moon Jae-in has huge plans. He would like to start something along the lines of the European Coal and Steel Organization that was the predecessor to the EU. He would like to get Russia, Mongolia, China, Japan, North Korea, and South Korea united through rail and port and road links so that trade is facilitated through all these places. The two sides agreed to adopt practical steps towards this connection. Last week, the South and North Koreans were supposed to take a train from South Korea across the DMZ into the north and up into Russia. And they were going to look to see where do we need to strengthen bridges and so forth. The U.S. said no. The American general who's in charge of the U.S. Forces Korea, a man named Vincent Brooks, General Brooks is also double-hatted. He runs the UN command there, and the UN command is in charge of the DMZ. So we said, they're going to take the train up to North Korea, and then they're going to bring the train back, and there's a bunch of fuel on the train. And you remember, you can't bring fuel into North Korea. There's a UN sanction against importing fuel. And he also said that the documentation wasn't delivered on time, and you didn't fill out this page right, and so forth. So. Ending provocations. So South and North Korea have, over the years, provoked each other in ways that stopped short of military conflict, but just kind of pissed each other off, if I can say that. And I want to talk about some of the ways they've done that. One was through harassment in the Western Sea. When the armistice was signed in 1953, they agreed on the land border for the DMZ, but at that time, neither side had a navy, and they didn't really discuss where the line should go out into the ocean. And so there's a disagreement about where that should go, and I'll show you in a map in just a minute. And then I also want to talk about the broadcasting and the leaflets that they shower on each other full of propaganda. We can look at some of those because they would fall into my yard in Seoul all the time. Okay, so I'm going to have to step over the map for just a minute. So this is the DMZ coming from east to west. This is the West Sea, and China's on the other side of the sea. This is agreed upon, and then it stops. These islands belong to South Korea, and there are international law about territorial waters. So the Americans and the UN, which we run, the UN command, they drew this line and said that everything south of that line are South Korean territorial waters. The North Koreans said, we will recognize your territorial water here. The line they drew goes like this, and up around the islands and then back down again. So this, between the red line and the blue line, is disputed water. And there's a constant harassment. South Korean fishermen get chased by North Korean boats. North Korean and Chinese fishermen get chased by South Korean boats. And there's actually been, there was a ship, a South Korean ship that was sunk here, the Cheonan. 46 people lost their lives, and sometimes, this is very close here, they can shell each other. So they agreed, we're going to stop this provocation. It's not achieving anything. We should stop that. These are the little leaflets, and I'm sorry I didn't bring them. I have a whole bag of them because my kids would collect them when they walked the dog. I lived on a U.S. Army base in the center of Seoul, and we would find these things in the yard all the time. There were signs up that would say, if you find one of these, you have to turn them into the military police. These are contraband, you're not allowed to keep them. And I would bring them into the embassy to show them to my Korean colleagues, and they, when we were kids, if we found one of those, we had to turn it in at school. We got punished, but if we turned in 5 of them, we'd get a pencil, and if we turned in 7, we'd get an eraser. But we, at the embassy, we were always curious because it kind of showed a little bit about which way the political winds were blowing. And this one, I don't know if you can see very well, but at the very bottom of it, there's a man with a shock of blonde hair. Doesn't identify him, but I think you can guess probably who it is. The North Korean shoes are stomping on his head, and it's quite bloody and gruesome, actually. The graphics are quite disrespectful, to be honest. Trump has said that Kim Jong Un has never said anything disrespectful about me, but I don't think he's seen this one. But it says at the top, the gang leader who brings nuclear disaster to this land. And then at the bottom it says, pass judgment in the name of the people. So this came out about the time of the Fire and Fury rhetoric, about 13 months ago. And then, a few months later, in the prelude to the Olympics, we had this one. And you can see the blue peninsula, that's the symbol of the United Koreas. So when their sports teams play, they wear a jersey with no flags on it, but it just has that symbol on it. And this is, I think, a much less violent, much less provocative propaganda, although it's clearly still propaganda. The great leader Kim Jong Un is the leader of the people's great solidarity and brings us a new morning of unification. Let's go and welcome the son of unification. But my kids thought these things were a riot. Going back to that agreement that was signed in April of this year then, a new agreement ending the war must not be delayed. That's the last sentence here. And then finally, at the very end, the 6th of the 6 paragraphs, we get to South and North Korea confirm the common goal of realizing through complete denuclearization a nuclear-free Korean peninsula. It doesn't say that North Korea is going to give up its nuclear weapons. It says both sides have responsibility. They both share this common goal, and so forth. I don't know what South Korea's responsibility is supposed to be. South Korea doesn't have nuclear weapons. I'm not sure how they're going to achieve a nuclear-free Korean peninsula. The last page mentions that there should be more meetings, and as I said, next Tuesday there will be another summit between Moon and Kim. Now let's compare that agreement with the actual text of the agreement between Trump and Kim. There were only 4 people in the room. There were interpreters. And I know Dr. Lee, who's the State Department interpreter, who was at that meeting. And she's keeping her mouth shut. She wouldn't tell me. What did he say? Come on, just tell me. She's being very discreet, which is to her credit. So here's the first page. And some people on the North Korean side are arguing that the order of the points in this agreement indicate the chronological order in which the activities should take place. I'm not an international lawyer. I don't know if it matters. But if you look at this, the denuclearization part usually comes towards the end. So U.S. is going to establish new relations. Well, we've seen that a few times already. We're going to build a lasting and robust peace regime. That means we're going to replace the armistice with some form of statement that says we have no intentions of attacking you, possibly even a peace treaty if we can get 67 senators to sign it. Trump commits to provide security guarantees, and at the end, Chairman Kim reaffirms his firm and unwavering commitment to complete denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. So Pompeo and other American officials say, well, you promised to do this. You haven't done it yet. We're not going to fulfill our terms until you fulfill yours. This is the first, there's only a few paragraphs. It's quite a short agreement. The first paragraph, convinced that the establishment of new relations will contribute to peace, and recognizing that mutual confidence building can promote the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. The North Koreans point to this and say, look, it says mutual confidence building helps promote denuclearization. We're not going to denuclearize until you do the mutual confidence building. Signing a peace agreement, lifting sanctions, doing things that improves trust will lead us to denuclearize, not the other way around. The 4 points, the U.S. and North Korea commit to establish new relations. Point 2, the U.S. and North Korea will join their efforts to build a lasting and stable peace regime. That means to replace the armistice with a peace treaty. Number 3, North Korea commits to work towards complete denuclearization. And then number 4 is the exchange of POW remains. Interestingly, number 4 is the only one that's actually started. And the second paragraph says that the U.S. team will be led by Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and his counterpart on the other side, and that at the earliest possible date, they'll have meetings to start the implementation of this. They haven't had a meeting yet. There was going to be a meeting. It was called off because I think the American side felt that not enough progress had been made. Third paragraph, they've committed to cooperate for the development of new relations, and then it was signed in Singapore on June 12th. So I argue that Seoul and Washington have very dissimilar perspectives. One of my bosses in Seoul, Ambassador Mark Lippert, he was the one who was slashed on the face, if you remember. He finished every speech he made with this slogan that we hear a lot over there, Kachi Kapshida. So Kachi means together, and Kapshida is the imperative version of to go. So it basically means, come on, let's go together. We're in this together, let's go forward together. Since I'm retired, I can say our official line is always that there's no daylight between the position of South Korea and the U.S. I think that that's a bit disingenuous. I think South Korea is much more interested in improving relations and moving forward with trust-building measures. The U.S. is putting a higher priority and a more urgent priority on denuclearization. But this statement by the South Korean president's advisor was in the Atlantic Magazine interview in August of this year, just a couple of weeks ago. And it says, the current stalemate comes from the difference between North Korea and the U.S. on which comes first. The belligerents from the Korean War proclaiming the conflict over, or North Korea disclosing the components of its nuclear weapons program and permitting international inspectors to access them. So does North Korea come first and say, here's our nuclear program? Or do the belligerents, the U.S. and North Korea, sign a peace agreement? That's basically where we're at right now, and that's behind the stalemate. And then, as I mentioned, there are several reasons why the U.S. has not allowed measures that South Korea wanted to help improve inter-Korean relations. Where is Tim? Tim, how am I doing for time?
Good.
7 o'clock? So maybe I'll just do this statement by Moon Jae-in and then we can go to questions. If you look, Moon Jae-in, he made a speech on August 15th. August 15th is a Korean holiday. It's the only holiday that's celebrated in both North Korea and South Korea. And they're celebrating the victory over Japan Day because Japan occupied Korea from 1910 to 1945 when they surrendered after World War II. It's a very important day politically in Korean history. And so on August 15th, he makes this speech and he says, advancing inter-Korean relations is not a secondary effect from achieving progress in North Korean and U.S. relations. Rather, it is advancement in the inter-Korean relations that provides the energy to promote the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. And he points out, when inter-Korean relations were good in the past, the North Korean nuclear threat diminished and we were able to achieve an agreement. So South Korea wants to move ahead improving economic ties. They want to move ahead improving political and cultural ties. The U.S. is saying, hold on, denuclearization first. And that's the stalemate that we're at right now. And we're hoping that in the summit between Moon Jae-in and Chairman Kim next Tuesday, that they'll come up with some formula that allows us to break that stalemate. There's a lot of goodwill right now, a lot of excitement right now. There's some good people working on this. We can talk about the American team later if you'd like. But not much has really been done, not many concrete measures on either side. We didn't have our military exercises one cycle. North Korea has agreed to shut down a test site for nuclear weapons, but almost all of the experts I talked to say that the most recent test that they did at that site destroyed the site, and it's not safe to use it anymore. So they've agreed to no longer use a site that can no longer be used. That's not really a concession. And then there's a missile site where they've tested rocket engines. They started dismantling a couple of buildings right after the June summit. They've stopped dismantling those buildings. And also, it was a missile site that was used to test liquid-fueled rockets. And if you know anything about military use of military rockets, you put the missile in a cave with the liquid fuel in a refrigerator somewhere. It's cooled, it's chilled. You bring the missile out, you set it on the gantry, and you start fueling it. You can't put the fuel in the rocket until you're ready to launch it, maybe a couple of hours before, because the fuel is very volatile and has to stay chilled. If we're a bunch of retired people talking about this missile site in Minneapolis, I'm pretty sure the intelligence agencies know all about this, and they're watching it as well. And so if you see the missile come out and they start fueling it, hello, they're going to use this missile, maybe you should send in a couple of, so it had limited, my point is it had limited military usefulness. So North Korea really hasn't made any concessions, and all we did was cancel one cycle of our exercises. So there's been a lot of goodwill, a lot of excitement, a lot of expectations, but not much has happened yet. And stay tuned, I guess, is all I can say. So why don't we open it up for questions? We've got about 20 minutes, and you can ask away anything you'd like. Yes?
Mark, as long as we have Moon Jae-in on the screen here, we've talked about his personal investment and commitment to the reunification process dating back to when he was Chief of Staff, I believe, for...
Yeah, he was Chief of Staff for Roh Moo-hyun. Yeah.
Can you go into a little bit more about him personally, his history, his
Is there a quick way to get back to the map, or I have to go through 60? So Moon Jae-in is a liberal. Typically, the liberals have a slight anti-American attitude about them. He doesn't. So Moon Jae-in's parents, here's the DMZ. His parents are from this city here. So Moon Jae-in's parents are from this city right here. And if you'll forgive me, I'm going to impose a little bit more history on you. June 25th, 1950, the Korean War starts. Before the war, we had intentionally not been arming South Korea because we didn't want South Korea to start a war. Russia and China had been arming North Korea, so they had tanks, these guys had rifles. It wasn't much of the start of the war, it was pretty one-sided. It took them 3 days to cross the DMZ and take over Seoul. And they started pushing down and down and down and down and down. We brought in people as quickly as we could to Busan, the port here, and we built a perimeter called the Busan Perimeter. And we were able to stop them and keep this little corner of the country in Allied hands. Then in October of 1950, a few months after the start of the war, MacArthur does his Incheon landing here, cuts the North Korean supply line. The North Koreans retreat back up here. We chase them. We go all the way up to the Chinese border. China sends in a couple of 100,000 infantry. They chase us back down. Now we're in a retreat. And there's a group of Marines that were stuck right here at a place called Chosun Reservoir. This is Christmas of 1950, one of the worst, coldest winters ever in Korea. And they have to fight their way out. They're surrounded by North Koreans and Chinese. They fight their way out, and they get to this port city here. And we have a bunch of U.S. Navy ships there to evacuate them. The protocol in war is you never take civilians on Navy ships, because if the ship gets sunk during a battle, you'd be responsible for the death of all the civilians. So they load up the ships with the tanks and the jeeps and all the American soldiers, and they get ready to go. Well, there was a South Korean doctor who was a civilian liaison with the U.S. forces, and he says, you can't leave these people here. They're going to die. There's no food. The Chinese troops are coming. They're going to slaughter everybody. You got to get these people out here. And the Americans say, no, we don't do that. And these ships, there's a bunks for 14 people on this ship, just for the crew. How are we going to get 100,000 people onto this ship? But the South Korean, much to his credit, he manages to persuade the American colonel who's in charge of that to evacuate everybody. So they throw the jeeps and everything into the ocean, they blow up everything they can, and they put the civilians on the ship. They evacuate everybody down to Busan, and Busan says, we don't have any space. Where are we going to put 100,000 people? Get them out of here. So they go off to a little island down here called Goje, and they drop everybody off. And the couple here, Moon Jae-in's parents, are part of that ship. And Moon Jae-in is born on this little island down here, Goje. He goes on to become president, and he tells us, I'm not anti-American. I'm eternally grateful to the Americans because without you, I wouldn't be here. The U.S. Navy will always have a place in my heart. I love you guys. Please don't misunderstand. But this is my country, and I want to reunite it, and I want to do what I can to strengthen ties with the people. You look at those agreements, none of them ever has anything about improving the lives of the North Korean people. Nothing in there says, we need to do something about the human rights abuses in North Korea. We need to upgrade their standards. We need, it's all about military stuff in the American agreements anyways. So Moon Jae-in is, he's an interesting figure. He was a human rights lawyer. He's fairly liberal. And he's been relatively popular. If he can pull this off, he'll be very popular. But a lot of young Koreans, I think anybody under about 30, they're not as committed to reunification as Moon is. The people over 70 still remember, they had relatives in North Korea. They remember what it was like under Japan when it was one peninsula. But the young people, they're like, why do I need this? The North Korea has nothing to do with me. It's a separate country, and it's just going to cost a lot of money. Did you see how much it cost Germany? I'm not sure I want to do that. So we'll have to see. I can say a couple of other words about unification. People might be interested in this. The previous president, Park Geun-hye, who's now serving 25 years in prison, just last week, she was sentenced to 24 years. Her lawyer went and appealed to the judge, and the judge said, you're right, I don't agree with the sentence. It should be 25. Yeah. I thought Michael Cohen was a bad lawyer. But she said that unification would be a jackpot because South Korea has one of the lowest fertility rates in the world. I just listened to a BBC story last week, and they said it was actually the lowest in the world. I personally don't agree with that. I think the lowest rate of fertility in the world is probably the Vatican, but it's just a little bit. But on average, it's one child per woman. And you need 2.1 just to maintain the same population. So the population is plummeting, and the population is aging, and they have labor-intensive industries, and they have mandatory military conscription. They need people. They need young people. And they say, where can we get well-educated, disciplined, Korean-speaking young people? Obviously, North Korea is the place to go. So they have a lot of incentives to unify. Anyways, with the microphone.
I just wanted to cover the human rights issue of North Korea and then North Korean refugees. There are North Korean refugees in China, approximately over 200,000. They have no rights. If they live there for 20 or 30 years, still Chinese police catch them and send them back to North Korea. And then they either die or it's just awful.
Could I interrupt you for just a second? I want you to go back to it. But some of you might not understand, if you live in North Korea and you go to a South Korean diplomatic mission anywhere else in the world, you can go up to Mongolia, to Ulaanbaatar, or you can go down through China to Vietnam, to Thailand, to Laos, and get to a South Korean diplomatic mission. The South Korean government will give you a passport, fly you back to Seoul, and then start you in a resettlement program. So there are now about 31,000 people who've fled North Korea and gone to South Korea.
South Korea. So my question to you is this. I don't trust Kim Jong Un. I don't trust North Korea. So as a Korean who is over 7 years old, and then what they want is when they want to have a peace treaty and when they want to denuke the whole peninsula, that means the U.S. troop has to get out of there, and then they want to just Korea to do it. Moon Jae-in's father and mother might be saved, but Moon Jae-in at Pyeongchang Olympic, he claimed that his mentor is one of the very just horrible communists, that's his mentor. So my worry is this, that there's a Russia and there's a China, and then actually in 1948, U.S. troop and U.S. left Korea. Then Soviet, Stalin and Kim Il-sung, plot that war and then bulldoze down to South Korea. So, there's, then some of the Koreans are worried about North Vietnam, how that had happened with North and South Vietnam. There's a lot of people got killed. So I just am asking you, do you think that USA will ever sign the peace treaty and then pull the troop out of South Korea? That's my question.
Okay. We have in the past stated publicly as part of negotiations with North Korea that we have no intent of attacking North Korea. We've already done that, in fact. And I wouldn't be surprised to see something short of a full peace treaty, some kind of presidential proclamation saying we have no intention of launching a war with North Korea, something along those lines. I think there's a disincentive to go the full treaty route because you have to get the Senate to do it, and that's not going to happen before the midterm elections, and it's a longer road, I think, for that. As to whether the American troops are going to pull out, right now there's about 28,500 troops there. That number has gone up and down a lot. And there used to be a lot more when I was there. It was in the 30,000s, 35,000. At one time we had more than 50, I believe. There's nothing set in stone about that number. I wouldn't be surprised if we do have a treaty that there'll be some pressure to reduce the number of troops. But I don't see us pulling out altogether. And in fact, I've heard many American officials, military officials, say that there's no intention, no scenario under which we would pull everybody out.
Mark, the diplomacy on this currently seems to be very personal between Donald Trump and Kim Jong Un.
Right.
But there is a team of Korea experts working on this. Can you give us some background on who's in the room and who's going to be moving this forward?
Yeah, I'm going to quickly run through this while I talk. President Trump does things a little bit differently. And I go out on a limb and say that. Normally you would have the working bees like me would negotiate for a long, long time, and then the president would come in at the end of it and take credit for it all and sign it. He's going the other direction. The working bees haven't started their talk yet. And he's already meeting the person. I think his argument is that it's going to jumpstart the process. It'll give it a lot more incentive and energy. Okay, so I can talk a little bit about the team. He's got a pretty good team, and in full disclosure, this man was my boss when I first went to Seoul. His name is Sung Kim. He was born in Korea, came to the United States, was a lawyer, joined the State Department. As a young official, was assigned to Embassy Seoul in the political section. He later became the head of the U.S. delegation to the six-party talks that we talked about. And after that, he became the U.S. ambassador to Seoul. After that, we have a special job in the State Department called the Special Representative for North Korean Policy. And he was that job. When Rex Tillerson became head of the State Department, beginning of the Trump administration, he said, I don't like all these special envoys. You know, they're off doing their own thing. They're not integrated into the architecture of the State Department. Let's get rid of them. That was his job. Right now, his day job is ambassador to the Philippines. But I think Song Kim is probably the most experienced person in the U.S. government when it comes to negotiating nuclear issues with North Korea. And he has been brought in, and I'm glad about that. Song Kim was succeeded. He left in September of 2016. He was succeeded by Ambassador Joseph Yun. And he started the next month. Almost immediately, we found another Korean-speaking, Korean-American with decades of experience in Asia and Korea. On this, this is Mike Pence. This is Song Kim. Mike Pompeo. This is Mike Biegun. He just started last month in the job Song Kim had, the special representative for North Korea. A lot of foreign policy experience. He was a foreign policy advisor to Senator Bill Frist. He worked for Condoleezza Rice in the National Security Council. If you remember when John McCain picked Sarah Palin to be his vice president, she didn't have a lot of foreign policy experience. And so they brought in somebody to teach her as much as she could learn in a short time. They brought in this guy, Steve Biegun. A smart guy, a lot of experience, not a Korean expert. In college, he went to the University of Michigan, studied Russian, and most of his expertise was in Europe. The last few years, he's been doing intergovernmental relations for Ford. And I'm pretty sure that he didn't deal with North Korea in that capacity. But a smart guy. And the last guy in the end here, Andrew Kim, is the point person at the CIA for Korea. There's a couple of other people not in this picture. One is Dr. Allison Hooker. She's at the National Security Council, smart lady, decades of experience. Mark Lambert, who's the head of the Korea section at the State Department, he's been negotiating. And Mark Napper. Mr. Napper was the acting ambassador at the embassy in Seoul for the last 2 years, speaks fluent Korean. He was, remember that picture with Madeleine Albright and Kim Jong Il? He was with Madeleine Albright on that trip. So I know Trump has been criticized a little bit for putting people in positions of power because of their ideology or loyalty. But in this case, I think he deserves credit. He's put together a good team. My only criticism about Mr. Biegun is that it took too long to find him. When Song Kim retired, Ambassador Yoon replaced him the next month. Ambassador Yoon retired. I went through the retirement seminar with him at the State Department. He retired back in February. And Mr. Biegun only was appointed in August. So if this is a high priority for you, an urgent priority for you, we probably, ideally, we would have found somebody in less than 6 months. But it's a pretty good team. Now, Mr. Carlson here, he did a lot of arms control talks in Geneva. And the logistics of the talks, it can be important, and I want to explain why. Because I argue that time is not on our side for this. If you look at all of the people in the six-party talks, Chairman Kim Jong Un, he's not facing re-election anytime soon. Xi Jinping, he was appointed president in March, and at the same time, they eliminated term limits. So he's probably going to be there for a while. Putin, he began a 6-year term just this year, so he's good until at least 2024, and I wouldn't place any bets on him leaving then. President Moon began last year in May, so he's good until 2022. Interestingly enough, South Korea only allows 1 term. I kind of like that idea. And then Prime Minister Abe, he began in October of 2017, so he's good until 2021. So the person who's under the greatest time constraints is Trump. You know, we don't have that much time to waste, and it took 6 years to find a replacement for the North Korean policy person. So I would have liked to have seen that job filled a little bit earlier. And also, you know, don't forget, if we're going to do something with a treaty, you need time to get 67 senators to vote. I don't think you could get 67 senators to agree that it's Wednesday. You know? Not in American Samoa, it's not. Yeah. Yeah, it just, things take time here, and I'm worried that the clock can run out on us. Oh, are we out of time?
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Okay, sorry.
You can ask afterwards.
Afterwards, huh?
Yeah, great.
Thanks, Carol.
Great. Well, thank you.